Hello YouTube! This video is a short tutorial for QuickBrush version 1. This is my new editor extension for Unity. It's a tool that lets you take your library of prefabs and mass place them onto any surface in your scene by painting them on like a brush stroke. And it also gives you access to all kinds of useful settings for randomizing and fine-tuning your results. I'll get into the settings in a moment, but first let me just cover the basic controls. You activate the brush by holding down Control. While holding Control, you click and drag the mouse to paint your prefabs into the scene. Now, this is great for placing objects in bulk, but there may be times when you want to be able to place a single object more precisely. You can do this by holding both Control and Shift, and then clicking and dragging. This gives you a handle to scale and rotate the object. Now, to remove objects that were placed by QuickBrush, you can delete them manually, or you can use the eraser. Pressing Ctrl and X makes QuickBrush toggle between the additive brush and the eraser tool. Alright, so let's take a look at QuickBrush from the top. This first icon here indicates which tool is currently in use, whether it's the eraser or the brush, and whether it's active or not. Next to that, we have a quick reminder of the different keyboard shortcuts. And below we have a drag and drop field for prefabs. So you can select stuff from your project folder and drag it in here, and it gets put into a list. Once it's in that list, each item gets a preview window and 3 controls. The first control, the slider, determines how likely the prefab is to be randomly chosen for placement versus the other ones in the list. Clicking this red X just removes the prefab from the list. And selecting an item with this green check mark bypasses the randomization algorithm and just places that item exclusively. So then when no prefab in the list is checked, the tool will just draw randomly from the list based on the slider values. Otherwise, if you pick an object, it'll only place that object. Now, this is especially useful for individual placement, where you want to be able to choose the specific item that you're going to place. Now let's take a look at the drop-downs. The first one is brush settings. Here you can set the radius of the brush. You can set the upper and lower limits of this slider here. And then we have scatter amount, and that determines how much of the surface area of the brush is used to randomly scatter objects that we're placing. So if the value is set to 0, everything is placed right in the center of the stroke. But if we turn it up, we get this nice distribution. The next control is stroke spacing. Stroke spacing basically determines how much space the brush has to cover before it places the next object. So you can have a really lazy brush that only places stuff once in a while, or you could have one that packs things really closely. Now you may have noticed that my brush completely ignores these buildings. It doesn't seem to interact with them in any way, and it only interacts with the ground. And that's because I used the sorting settings to only paint to the layer named other stuff. And it just so happens that the ground is the only thing on that layer. So if we were to switch to the structures layer that the buildings are on, now it only paints onto the buildings and doesn't paint onto anything else. There's another level of fine-tuning here. You can click Paint to Selection. These settings stack on top of each other, so now the brush will only paint on selected objects and only ones that belong to that layer. So the next thing you might have noticed is that all these objects that I'm placing are just being dumped into the hierarchy, and that's really messy. So the way to solve that problem is using groups. First, let me just erase all this stuff. So we have to add a group first, and it shows up in the scene hierarchy. So now when we paint, we don't just get loose objects in the hierarchy. They all get parented to the group. And now we can just really easily select them and delete them if we want to. Now let's check out the mesh rotation dropdown. In this dropdown, the first two toggles are alignment settings. Align to stroke makes placed objects line up with the direction that you're dragging the mouse. And align to surface makes objects align to the surface that you're painting on. So with these settings turned off, objects will just align to world axes. And from there, we can use these sliders to offset the rotation. So whatever the original rotation of the object from the alignment settings is, we can set the upper limit for randomly offsetting its rotation about each of its local axes. So here's a stroke with alignment, and here's a stroke with random offset on the y-axis. The last dropdown is the mesh scale dropdown. Mesh scale uses split sliders to set the upper and lower limits of how the size of objects is randomized. So here we have a setting of 0.1 all the way up to twice the original scale of the prefab. And it looks something like this. And you can do this per axis, which means that each local axis gets randomized separately within its own range. And by the way, if you don't split the slider, you're basically setting the exact scale that you want. So by playing with these settings, you can get all sorts of different variations and shapes. And of course, you can set the upper and lower limits of all these sliders up here. And finally, at the very bottom of the window, we have an anchored help box, which basically shows you a tooltip for each control that you hover over. All right, and that wraps it up for version 1 of QuickBrush. You can pick up QuickBrush on the Unity Asset Store, linked below. I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback on any features and improvements you'd like to see in future versions of the tool. QuickBrush is part of the Procore toolset. There's some really neat and extremely useful stuff in there, so check it out at procore3d.com. That link is in the description, and you'll also find it at the bottom right corner of this video. The nature meshes I used in this demo were generously provided by Michael O, and you can find a link to his stuff in the description as well. Thanks.